Excellent. So it is Monday, April 29th, 2024, Human Design Catalyst. I'm joined here by Lasita, Ricky, and Shango. Good to see you all. And we're going to talk about base theory today. So I've been preparing some of my notes on base, and I'm going to be sharing some graphics. Base theory is such a wide topic that what I've really decided to do is I'm going to start with the personal. We're going to talk a little bit about the personal aspects of base, and then I'm going to go into the macrocosm, the kind of. So I'm just going to get situated for a moment. If you want to hear it, you're going to have to come over here because it's going to be distracting if you're over there. So yeah, if you want to join, please do. Otherwise, okay, there we go.
I'm actually going to go and tell Genoa that you're going to talk about base theory and see if he has any time to join us.
Oh, that would be wonderful. I would love
Not
that.
that we know a lot about it. He asked me to ask you to teach about it because we don't know a lot about it.
Well, I love this topic. It's one of my favorite aspects of human design, and it is the one part of human design that I saved for myself until about, I would say 4 years ago. And to me, it was like an incredibly delicious meal that I had waited to eat. You know, it's kind of like when you have a favorite author and you wait to read their masterpiece, you know, something like that. And hi there, Nancy. Excited that you've joined as well. So, yeah, I'm going to share a couple graphics in a moment. I'm just going to kind of get situated here, and I have my notes. And it's such a vast topic, but I really do enjoy it. So, okay, I have my notes here, and maybe before we dig into them, I'll also just explain a little bit about how I, like, kind of what it's done for me, how I was able to experience base theory and kind of how it changed how I see the world. So for me, the first question I had when I was getting into base theory was basically around how are these dimensions, because Ra calls them dimensions, and I have a lot of time spent studying quantum physics and string theory and things like that. So when I think of dimensions, what I really think of is well, the spatial dimensions, the dimensions of time, and then perhaps other spatial dimensions we don't have any awareness of. So that's kind of where I began. But I could see really quickly that what Ra was talking about with base was not dimensions as we were familiar with. And so actually I like to start with the microcosm because I think once we get the handle of what he means at a microcosmic level, at a personal level of you experiencing your own life, then it becomes easier to see base play out in different ways. So to begin with, I'm actually just going to show this graphic here. I just took a screenshot of this in preparation. And this was, Ra said he started an experiment at the Ibiza event, and he would continue to do it, which was to create the images out of a descriptive capacity. But these images are, for him, all formulas. And he shows this image here, which he says that he first drew in 1989 for the Black Book. And there really is a section in the Black Book on base, but the first people who ever looked at that manuscript, that was the part they threw up their hands and said, I don't know what this man is talking about. And this is one of his oldest illustrations. So I'm going to start with this one. Hopefully it's a decent enough size that we can see it. Maybe I'll actually, I wonder if I have another version that I can get that's a little larger. Just a moment here. But this is one of the first images that he developed. Yeah, let's see if this will go. Unfortunately, it's a little bit pixelated. Let's see. We'll just do our best. I just took a couple screenshots of images in preparation for this. So, okay. Yeah, everyone can see that, right? I mean, it's a little bit. There we go. Got it a little bit larger. Okay, so it's a lot of keynotes, a lot of words. It's very complex. It seems, a little bit, how do we even understand this? Well, what I want to start with is I want to make it very personal. In fact, so personal that I want us to imagine ourselves right in the middle as the personality, as the passenger, the awareness that is experiencing everything else. And for this level of base theory, I want us to just start with the notion that our awareness can move into any of these corners from the middle. You'll see these corners here. Evolution, design, movement, being. And you can imagine the middle as a cockpit. So you can really imagine that I guess in the passenger seat, not really the driver's seat, but you're in a seat in this cockpit and you're experiencing all these things happening. And when you're in that basic awareness, this is the personality itself. This is what we consider self-reflected consciousness, or however you want to call it. This is the pure awareness of your own personhood, your own personality, and it's the awareness of space itself, which we can return to. But now I want to say, what happens if you start to remember something? Well, typically you remember something, you maybe go a little bit towards the mind. The mind is over here in the top left corner. The mind has the keynote of I remember. It's not shown on this graphic here, but it has to do with memory, because the mind is a sort of ever accumulating ontological memory, which I know is kind of a fancy thing to say, but it actually, it really is somehow outside of us. It is its own dimension. It's like we remember, where does the memory come from? Scientists can't find the part of the brain that the memory comes from. It is this other dimension that we access. Now, what happens is, as long as you remain somewhat conscious and somewhat cognizant of things, then you notice the memory as something outside of you. You being kind of this personality in the cockpit, you notice the memory, but you don't necessarily go into a reverie. But what happens is, in certain cases, you can go so fully into the memory that you actually are completely absorbed in that dimension, so to speak. If you think of Marcel Proust's In Remembrance of Things Past, that's a 5,000-page novel, one of the greatest works of literature ever written, which is essentially a deep exploration of memory. The entire thing is triggered by a memory, and as soon as he's triggered into that memory, he's no longer in the personality. And in fact, when we read and we're reading something and it reminds us of something, we can go into that memory and we can kind of cross-reference what we're reading with how we experienced it, and we can remember different things and so on. And so this is one way that the personality moves. The personality can move into the mind. Now, the keynotes here are a little bit more at the macrocosmic level, because ultimately the mind is about evolution. Evolution of all of us. And the point is that the mind accumulates, and so the only way evolution really works is through death. Because eventually the mind, when it begins, it's learning, and then by the end it's teaching, and it can't learn anymore. I mean, thankfully, we can pretty much learn our entire lives up until our death, but what we learn changes. We're not able to approach with the same freshness of a new mind, so to speak. And so what evolution can be seen as is the ever-accumulating collective mind that each individual is sort of born and lives and dies and then reincarnates. And what Ra says here is that we actually need to die and reincarnate because of mind. If it wasn't this dimension of mind, we wouldn't have to reincarnate. But the mind kind of only adds, it never subtracts. Once you've learned something, you can't unlearn it. Once you know something, you can't forget it. Not really. Not really. It's still there somehow. So the only option is really death, and then we reincarnate and come back with a fresh mind. But even though we reincarnate with a fresh mind, the ontological mind, which is a philosophical term that simply means out there in reality, that dimension of mind continues accumulating. It doesn't actually get erased. It just continues to grow. So the collective mind only ever really grows. And sure, we lose things, we culturally lose things, but they're never really lost. They're still out there in the ether somewhere. And so from this perspective, you can see when Carl Jung discovered the collective unconscious, part of what he discovered was this dimension of mind that is external to any one person. And in fact, there was a very interesting perspective shift. Normally, we would say someone like Mozart or Beethoven are very old. They're from the olden times. the old days. And if we go back further, you get to Plato and Socrates. They're really old. Or you go back to Lao Tzu, even older. But what Jung discovered was actually that they're only older from our perspective. Actually, from the cosmological perspective, we are older. We are the oldest people who ever lived. Mozart was a little baby compared to us. So was Plato. So was any of these older figures from an earlier time in history were actually younger. They were younger in the development of consciousness, in the development of the mind, because the mind had simply not accumulated as much knowledge at that time. It was a young mind. They were cut from the cloth of a younger psyche. So essentially what we find is that when you go to the dimension of mind, you realize this is ultimately about evolution, and this is about the ever-accumulating ontological memory of humanity, as well as, I suppose, the memories of every other creature as well. I mean, there are memories of birds and so on, shared memories. The paranormal researcher Rupert Sheldrake has a very interesting discovery. It was actually part of a TED Talk he gave. His discovery was that before the Great War, I guess it was at that time, I guess it was maybe the Second Great War, before World War II, there were these birds in the UK. And for many years, the birds had no way of accessing the cream that was delivered in milk deliveries. But then, shortly before the war, they figured it out. And not only did they figure it out, they all figured it out at the same time. The collective mind of these starling birds learned how to open up the milk, because at that time, milk deliveries just had a small, it wasn't even a plastic cap, it was a paper cap. And so the birds learned how to puncture the cap and eat the cream out of it. Well, they learned simultaneously across London, across all of the UK. And it was in all the newspapers, and everyone was, oh my word, all of our milk is being eaten by these birds. The cream is being skimmed. Well, sure enough, the war broke out, and they stopped milk deliveries. And there were no milk deliveries for about 9 years because of the war. There were just simply other things to be done. Well, what happened after the war is that the milk deliveries resumed. And even though there were around 20 generations of starlings, the birds hadn't forgotten. The birds immediately began with the milk again. So it raises the question, how did those birds remember how to get the milk out? It's the 100th monkey syndrome. You've probably heard of this. I mean, it's this incredible ontological unconscious, or mind that is somehow out there in a different dimension, such that 20 generations of birds could live and die and live and die. And then these new baby birds, which nobody has ever shown, the moment the milk delivery started again, the birds began to collect the milk. All right, he has another example. Sheldrake also pointed out in the field of crystallography. This is about as basic as you can get in chemistry, where you have two substances and you put a catalyst. And what happens is or even just have a substance and you add the catalyst, and over a certain amount of time, crystals will form. The crystallization will occur. Now, what's interesting is in crystallography, they have a range of time, and they basically have a p-value, a probability of the crystal forming within that time. So just for example, you take a certain substance and you add this catalyst. Within 1 hour, you have a 100% chance that crystal will form. Within 45 minutes, it's a 50% chance. Within 30 minutes, it's only a 10% chance. That means of all their tests, only 10 of them, or 10% of them, formed crystals within that first half hour, but 100% formed crystals by the end of that hour. Well, this is all very simple, very kind of basic chemistry. But what's interesting is when they started the field of crystallography, they set the ranges and they said, okay, yeah, the crystal will form within 1 hour. It might form within 30 minutes. Here's the probabilities. Well, over time, these measurements changed radically. So a crystal that formerly was guaranteed to form at 100%, 100% of them form within an hour. Now it's 100% in 20 minutes. None of them take longer than 20 minutes to form. Where did the extra 40 minutes go? And the explanation from scientists is that the earlier measurements were wrong. that the earlier measurements were simply wrong, or that if you take, it's the law of large numbers. If you flip a coin a million times, you're going to find parts of those coin flips where it's 50 heads in a row or it's 100 heads in a row, right? But what actually happened is that somehow that memory of how the crystal formed was recorded and saved. The quantum waveform collapse that could have gone this way or could have gone that way, they formed enough times that it became faster and faster and faster for them to form. And scientists to this day have no explanation for this fact other than the old measurements were wrong, law of large numbers. It seemed like it took an hour, now it takes 20 minutes. Well, Rupert Sheldrake has another explanation. When they began forming crystals, was a time in history when certain of these substances were just developed. These chemical substances never even existed before. And so reality itself had to learn how to do it, and it got faster and faster at it. And anytime there was a quantum waveform collapse that could have gone to the left or could have gone to the right, the more times it went to the left, the more it encouraged collapsing to the left in the future. See what I'm saying, right? It's almost that the first time something happens takes the most energy. And after something's happened 1,000 times, it takes less energy. So the path of least resistance encourages things to continue happening that have already happened before. It becomes easier and easier for them to happen again. This is the aspect of mind that we're looking at in base theory. So just keeping it at the personal level, this is what happens when you go into memory. This is what happens when you remember something. When you think about something that you know and you think back to a memory that you've had a previous time or something you learned or realized, this is the personal movement from your personality into memory. And most people, when they go into memory, they stay in the personality. So it's almost as if this becomes their awareness. Personality plus evolution. It's not that they lose it unless you so fully go into the realm of memory that you've really lost touch with everything around you. Now let's go to the opposite. What happens when you go into movement? This is when you're a whirling dervish and you're dancing and spinning so fast, you go so fully into the movement, nothing else exists. This is when you're a martial artist or a trapeze artist or a dancer or anything that an athlete. I mean, this is when you merge so fully with the movement of life itself that you may retain some small connection to the personality, but you certainly can't be remembering. Have you ever watched those, it's a trope in war movies where there's a guy who's thinking about his wife back at home and the other guy says, if you're remembering your home life, you're going to get killed. Well, why is that? Because you're trapped in the mind, you're trapped in the past, ultimately, and you're not present to the movement of reality. Now, this is also a good point, just to make a little side note, that Ra said that he did not invent strategy and authority. That strategy and authority was inscribed in the bases themselves. And what he believed is that mostly we are stuck in the mind. We use our mind to understand things. We use our mind often to make decisions to our peril, right? And we use our mind to impose the sort of will of the mind, if we could call it that, on the world. And actually, the mind has no way of accessing movement. And movement is not just movement like I'm moving. Movement is the movement of life itself. Ra likened it to a wriggling worm, that life itself is what moves. It is animated. And so what Ra actually said is, there are two paths to get from the mind to movement. Technically, I guess you could say there are three, through the, possibly through the awakening of the personality. But the paths that he said were through the body or the design. And in human design, we tend to equivocate the two. We talk about them equivalently quite often, and Ra did as well. He'd say, oh, you're a 5-1, you have a first-line body. Your design is first line, right? Well, absolutely, sure. And yet, in base theory, we see that the body and the design are actually different. That the body is here and the design is here. And that these are the two ways that the mind can access movement. So again, imagining yourself as this cockpit of personality, going into the mind, remembering, or going into the pure movement of life as you would in an athletic situation or a situation where you're dancing or moving or simply pure reaction It's kind of like in the book On the Road by Jack Kerouac, where he said what he really wanted was to get to reality as it was without any lag time. That most people had a few hundred milliseconds late, that their mind was preventing them from touching the actual movement of reality. But he wanted to reach that movement. And sometimes late at night, driving on a dark freeway, watching the lights on the line, he would merge so fully with the movement of the car that he would cease to be separate from it. He wouldn't remember his name. He wouldn't remember his past. He would be the pureness of the pure movement of an object moving in space. Now, on the body side, this is everything from hunger to sleepiness. We say there are 6 senses, well, 5 really in the West, and then the 6th being psychic intuition. Certain indigenous peoples had over 100. They had 150 senses. It's a sense to be hungry. That's a different sense. It's not touch. It's a sense to be sleepy. It's a sense to be in a humorous mood. It's a sense to be in a serious mood. There are so many ways that we can sense so many different things beyond just seeing, hearing, tasting, and so on. Although, of course, those are fundamental. And we know that from the study of tone in human design. But the body is essentially going to communicate, and in fact, so much of psychoanalysis in its original formation by Freud had to do with what was called conversion. Conversion symptoms, which were essentially the conversion of a psychological to a physical ailment. That somebody would faint, or they would start to get heart palpitations or sweaty palms, or they would have lightheadedness or any sort of physical thing. And what that was communicating was that there's something going on. There's something there that we didn't realize, right? And it was like this actual communication of the body. Well, similarly, as mentioned, Ra said that he didn't invent strategy and authority, that it's in base theory itself. And so the mind can notice the body. And what does it notice from the body? Is the body's relationship to the movement of life. So the mind can't directly access the movement, but the mind can access how the movement is communicated through the body. So anytime you go into a physical space, like if you go into a sensory deprivation chamber, it's an interesting question. What happens there? In the beginning, you start to notice your body. But then after a while, you can lose touch with your body. You're this personality in this sensory deprivation. You can really go into anything, right? You can start to notice your thoughts, your memories, but maybe you quiet your mind. Then you notice that you're really hungry and you wish you would have eaten earlier, or you notice that you're full, you didn't need to eat, or you notice you have to use the bathroom, or any of these things that you notice that are physical. But then once those are taken care of, you may drift over to the design side. So what is the design? The design is the unconscious, and it's not even really it's the other conscious. The other consciousness that is within you, that's within the same form, right? We're all binary consciousnesses. We have these two levels of our consciousness. We have our conscious awareness and we have our unconscious. I remember a dream I had where I was in a record store and there were cassette tapes everywhere, and I took one out and I played it, and it had a song, and it was a pretty good song, and the bass line was going and the drums, and then I put it away and I put another tape in and it was another song. And at that point I was pretty much lucid. I knew I was dreaming, and I thought, who has time to write all these songs? Who's writing all this music? That's the design. That's the unconscious. It's a productive unconscious that produces an inner world, the inner world that you see when you close your eyes. And it's different from the body. And I'll tell you what, if you're starving and you're thirsty, you can't go into that inner world. That inner world is mutually exclusive from the body having its needs met. And if you're in that inner world and then a tiger comes and you have to run away or something, your body is going to remind you because it's going to send you some adrenaline. You're going to feel that adrenaline. So it's funny enough, though, we don't really talk about this, but strategy and authority kind of has 2 different paths. It's either the mind getting in touch with the body and noticing the body, or it's the mind getting in touch with the design and noticing the design. And they're both valid ways of describing it. When I talk to people about a sacral response or splenic authority, or the feeling of how they experience their own emotional clarity, or even some of the more unusual authorities. Whatever the authority is, it's a way of getting in touch with the life force, which is a moving, living thing. It's getting in touch with the movement of life. So essentially, human design is there to get you out of all the top-down processing, to get you to stop placing your expectations on life and then being disappointed when it doesn't match them, and to get you to be in touch with either your body or your unconscious, or both at different times. And we typically conflate the two, and we call it the body and the unconscious kind of interchangeably. But it's not interchangeable, not really. They're actually pretty different. But these are really the paths. And some people say, evolution is, really the mind, that the mind is the enemy. They would say that evolution is the enemy even here. It's not the enemy. The mind is there to learn. And learning is accumulation. So the mind accumulates. And once we've learned all we can, all that's left is to pass it on and then die and then come back and learn some more. And that's what the mind is doing. It's accumulating. So it's not really the enemy. It seems like the enemy, but it's only the enemy if it's in an ivory tower isolated from everything else. And certain things can cause that. It reminds me of what Deleuze, the great French philosopher, said about alcoholics, that they essentially become they get trapped in a prison of their memories. The alcoholic who could have been a professional football player, who could have done this. He was the top player in his college, but he made a misstep, and he never pursued his dream, and now he's doing something else. And Deleuze said this is why we often call alcoholics has-beens, because they're living in the past. They're living in their memory. They're not actually touching life. He says that they drink because this hardens them to life. This puts up a barrier where they cannot be touched by life. And I think all addiction works in that way. It hardens you to the life force energy. So the mind is not the enemy, and yet so much of what human design is about is the education of the mind so that it can become comfortable trusting the body and trusting the unconscious. And those are the two ways the body can go, so the mind can go, to eventually get to movement. And that's kind of the goal. Because when you have access to the movement of life, you have access to what life is actually calling for right now and your own life force energy, which is, of course, your channels, or in the case of reflectors, their temporary access to life force energy. So I'm going to wrap up this part of it before we go on to the macrocosm, but I'll just open up to questions or comments, and I'll just say this is kind of a fun game you can play, which is to notice these 5 dimensions yourself. Notice how you can remember. Notice how you can get in touch with your body. Notice how you can imagine, and you can close your eyes and you can see images in your mind's eye. And then notice how you can move and be so merged into that movement that you cease to exist. And that ultimately the thing that is actually going into these places is the personality. So I'd like to continue in a moment, but if anyone has any comments, I'll check the chat as well. Yes, Marcel Proust, In Remembrance of Things Past. Isn't that the title? Or In Search of Lost Time. Yeah. In Search of Lost Time, translated as Remembrance of Things Past. That was the... So, question from Casey. Is the personality the spirit? Well, I don't know. It depends how we use it. I would say probably not, because we know that the personality crystal is our awareness as a passenger, and it's kind of hovering here. And we know that we access the spirit through the G center. In Search of Things Past. Yes, it was translated, so we have a couple, maybe different versions of it. But it is interesting to think that, there's some connection between memory and searching, like even a search engine like Google, you're searching the collective memory of humanity, things like that. As far as and if you have any comments, and otherwise we can talk.
We interrupted you. You were talking to Casey's question.
Oh, yeah. Well, so about the personality and spirit, these terms are used in very general ways, and they're very multivalent terms. But what I would say is the personality is really ultimately the personality crystal. It is what you experience as yourself, having this awareness of, your body, your mind, your memory, your imagination, and so on, your movement as an object through space, and so on. So the personality is the kind of thing that identifies with or takes possession of its attributes and experiences them as the passenger. And the spirit, I guess, at the personal level, is sort of one's ability to persevere through adversity and things like that, through a connection to some sense of purpose and meaning. And you could say the personality and the design are kind of like the spirit and the soul, but I really think that these words are too ambiguous to get very far in that way. The way I understand spirit is ultimately that there is a connection to something bigger than us, and there's a connection to what you could even call gods, or even the larger psychic totality of a person, and then the larger collective totality of all people, and all of these things. And that we each have our own personal tether to this, and that's through the G center. And so we have access, more or less, to our own personal spirit, which then has access to the greater spirit. But, there's many ways of understanding spirit. Ultimately, I do see it as opposite to the body. So I would say in the base schema, I would put spirit as design. And I'll share this graphic again so you can see what I mean, because the locations are very significant. And so if this is the body, and this is sort of the sensing, the sensation of the world, and this is the mind, this is the thinking and logical judgment, and this is the movement, which we actually feel. We feel when we're moved. We even say we're moved by something. Then ultimately, what is opposed to the body and what is adjacent to thinking and feeling is the spirit and the intuitive capacity and the imaginative capacity of humanity. So I don't know how valuable it is to make these associations, but if it helps, then that would... And where would Kundalini fit in base theory? No, I would say it has to do with movement more than design. Kundalini, I would say, is probably the 360, the channel between the root and the sacral, is kind of where I would put it in the body graph. And I mean, if I had to put it somewhere, that this base of the spine kind of root energy, the Muladhara chakra being the root chakra, and that's where the Kundalini is said to originate, and it works its way up. And I would put it, kind of as associated with base one. Now, I will make a couple comments here. One is it can be fun to make the associations. It can also be interesting not to make them. Like, they're both valid. I remember what James Hillman said when he was asked if the 4 functions of the psyche were the same as the 4 seasons, and if they were the same as the 4 biblical figures and the same as the 4 cardinal directions and this. And he said, no, all of those 4s are different, and people always want to collapse them into the same 4. But actually, this desire to collapse everything into everything else is the mind preventing any new learning from occurring. That anytime we can associate something with something we already know, all we've done is fit it into a box that our mind has already created. Now, on the other hand, I actually think that there is a great value in making these connections, because what base gives us is this incredibly fundamental way of dividing all things. And it's actually scary. Ra said that he spent about 6 months with base before he realized he could not continue studying base and remain sane. He actually could feel himself losing touch with his mission. As a desire person, he had a strong sense of purpose and mission to spread human design, to get people into it, to get it into the collective, to change the world, to wake up generators and remove some of this frustration and all this stuff. And he actually found that, personally speaking, he could not continue his study of base because he was concerned that he would literally go crazy from it. And this is Ra. This is Ra, someone who would speak backwards or would do all sorts of things that he didn't really care what anyone thought of him. And even he turned back from base theory. And I've caught a glimpse of this myself. I caught a glimpse of it when I began studying base, and through a number of radical realizations started to be able to see it in any and everything. So I'll explain what I mean briefly, and then we'll take a look at the macrocosmic and kind of zoom out from our personal experience of these dimensions and then look at it. But we already caught a little glimpse of the macrocosm talking about how the mind is the principle of evolution. But we'll go back to that in a moment. Okay, if you want to play the game of how to divide the world in base, the thing to realize, the place to start is the Pareto principle. If you're familiar with the Pareto principle, this is the principle called the 80-20 rule. And it's studied in business, it's studied in philosophy, it's studied in psychology, it's studied in economics, it's studied in mathematics and biology. I mean, it cross-cuts so many fields. It's so multidisciplinary. And what the Pareto principle says is things like 20% of women will give birth to 80% of children. 20% of customers will provide 80% of revenue. Let's find some examples here. Let me do a list of, should be pretty easy to find. 20% of criminals commit 80% of crimes. 20% of drivers cause 80% of all traffic accidents. 80% of pollution originates from only 20% of factories. 20% of employees produce 80% of the value for a company. It's the 80-20 rule.
That when Ra was talking about cognition and PHS, that what was important was following it 80% of the time.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. Yeah. Every 5 days, every 4 days, you just take a day off, the 5th day or something like that, Well, and so he loved the Pareto principle, and you can see it throughout Ra's work. And he would always he loved it because it is base. Because when we're looking at base, we're doing a division of 5, and that is 20%. And one base is 20% of the bases, and the others are the 80%. And so that division into 5, that 5-fold division, we find it in China. Ra had so much respect for the Chinese and would talk about the 5-element theory and said, really, in the West, we have 4 elements because the 5th element was censored, basically. The 5th element was ignored. Although even in the West, we had the 5th element of ether, however you want to call it. But so much of the West was trying to create the square. The square as, I can't really do it. See, I can't even make a square. I can only make a heart, right? I can't even make a heart. How do I do it? But anyway, they're trying to make a square. I guess, there we go. That's a square. And that so much of the West was attempting to make a square and was attempting to square everything off that the 5 didn't fit. The 5th had to be, eradicated somehow. And he loved that in 5-element traditional Chinese medicine, traditional Chinese astrology, traditional Chinese feng shui, and so on, it's all 5. It's all 5 all the way. So the Pareto principle is the division by 5, and if you want to start going down this base rabbit hole, my advice would be the next time you listen to a song, try to think of what parts, what bass would play. Genres of music, any of it. I mean, this is the real alchemy. All alchemy was about mixing. And so if you imagine bass 1, pure movement. Well, imagine 5 parts bass 1. We could call it 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Music like that wouldn't sound like anything you'd ever heard before. It wouldn't really affect your body. It wouldn't really affect, I don't know what it would be. I mean, it's pure 1, right? It would be pure movement. It's an interesting thought experiment. But then you can start to see something like blues, for instance. Blues has a lot of bass 2. And when you learn the keynotes of bass 2, you begin to recognize this. Bass 2 is the principle of character. It is, sorry, I actually realized one of the keynotes for bass 2 is spirit. So in answer to spirit, I guess spirit would be more bass 2 rather than bass 3 in that schema. Sorry, bass 4 in that schema. But in any case, like as an example of bass 2 has to do with character. It has to do with building character and kind of maintaining a spirit in the face of adversity. Well, think of all the blues singers who all have these kind of character names. where it's, lefty this and, one eye that, and all of these kinds of things are very bass too. Well, you see it in jazz also, but jazz also has quite an element of bass one because it has so much movement and so much, it's kind of like the soloist is like the movement that you're watching, like a firework or something, or like a dancer, the soloist is the dancer and they're going out on the stage and they're dancing around. So you could say that a lot of jazz might be 3 or 4 parts bass 2 and 1 part bass 1. But then you look at bass 3. Bass 3 is the principle of sexuality and love making and giving birth and all of these things that have to do with sensuality and sexuality. And that's obviously like R&B. People listen to Barry White. How many kids were made listening to Barry White? So Barry White is like almost pure bass 3. But then you hear a jazz song, they're playing a ballad. Well, it's probably a mixture of bass 1, 2, and 3. But then you get to bass 4. And bass 4 is the principle of will and ego. And that plays a role as well. In personal power. Think about the power that you sometimes feel listening to a classical song where it makes you feel like you are God, and you feel this grandiosity in the music sometimes. And then bass 5 is actually the principle of space itself, which is what music is. Music is the art of space, really, of creating a musical space. And so I think all music has to be at least 1 part bass 5, but then there's also bass 5 music, a band like Enya, or not a band, a solo musician, I guess, like Enya, where Enya is creating this atmospheric, a lot of chords and a lot of sweeping pads and synthesizers and all of this. Very bass 5. So I guess I'm just saying, if you want to play the game, you can kind of think of any genre, think of any film, any cultural artifact, any song, and you can kind of start to ask, what would its alchemical formula be? What would its parts be? And how would it be, 3 parts bass 2 and 2 parts bass 3 and things like that. So. All right, well, I'm going to continue on with the macrocosm now, and I'm going to go back to one of these graphics here. Let me find a good one. I guess we can go back to the graphic we had. That one's pretty good. Okay, so let me just go back to the graphic that we had open. And now we're going to kind of zoom out and look at bass from the macrocosmic perspective. From what is the big picture? What is it actually doing in the history of the world and things like that. So let's just do this in the order of the basses. We'll just start with bass 1. Bass 1 is the principle of movement. It's the principle of uniqueness or individuality. It's what says no 2 objects can occupy the same place. I am here and you are there, and if we try to occupy the same space, well, we have a name for that, but when 2 humans come together, often babies are made, but that's more in the being side of things. But at the base 1 level, this is just the principle that 2 things cannot occupy the same space. And at a fundamental level, we could imagine the first earliest civilizations, even pre-civilization, the earliest peoples, the earliest humans, it was base 1 that were looking for a new place. 2 peoples can't occupy the same valley, so one of them has to go. This is the principle of movement that says essentially we have to continue to see what's over the horizon. This is this fundamental, basic aspect of humanity which says we're going to see what's over the horizon. And the diagram for this is the double yang, or double yang, as it's pronounced. The double masculine, the double unyielding. It will not bend. This is the ultimate principle of pushiness. It's the double yang. There's no receptivity. Two things can't occupy the same space. If someone's standing here and someone else tries to stand there, they push into each other. So this is the pushiness, the unyielding, the unreceptive. This is the double yang, the fully masculine, the father. And as the father, it's essentially the principle of force. And what force is doing is finding a new place, So in the earliest civilizations or the pre-civilizations, the base one people would go out on an expedition to find the place to found the town. So they would go over past the horizon. They would go along the Bering Strait when it was, connected by an ice bridge and settle the, basically this is out of Africa. Who came out of Africa? The base ones. And then everyone else followed them. But the base one people didn't want to stay in Africa. They didn't want to stay where they were. They wanted to see what was over the horizon. Ra comments that it's very difficult for base one people in our current time when everything's been mapped out. That they've had to turn to weird subgenres of music, and they've had to turn to trying to find something new, and it's so hard to do at this late stage in human history. It was easy to do back then. The keynote is I define, because they define things. They give them their names. How many places are named after the person who discovered it? It was a base one person who put their name on it. Michael Steenbeck-Litvin is base one. When I met him about 12 years ago, he was working at a bookstore. And he was playing music that had some strange synthesizers, and then it had sounds of cars, and then a Japanese man talking on it. And I said, "What is this?" And he said, "It's car commercials from Japan from the early 90s. That's what base ones listen to. They want to listen to something that nobody else has ever listened to before. Listen to something that nobody has considered music. It was a base one who wanted to get photography into museums or wanted to get collage accepted as an art form. They're probably all into VR now or into AI or who knows what, right? But the base one is always looking for the next horizon. And they're ultimately not here to collaborate. They're not here to work with anyone. Compare that to base two. Base two is the son, no longer the father, but the eldest son. And this is yin-yang. This is cooperation in the service of force. So unlike the yang-yang that won't cooperate with anyone, the yang-yang says, I'm leaving. Can we follow you? You don't have to ask me. Just do what you will. I'm leaving, and they go to a new place. Well, base two, and I am base two, these are the people who ultimately want to cooperate, the yin, but for a higher purpose, the yang. Cooperation in the service of yang. So think about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal, and think about how many people came together to build things, or think about the building of the temples of Egypt, or think about the building of the Great Wall of China, or any of these large-scale productions. These were base two projects. Base two is what happens after you settle. The base one person settles, but then they move on to settle somewhere else. They want to discover something new. Well, then base two comes along and it says the first thing we need is hierarchy. We need hierarchy. If we don't have hierarchy, if we don't have division of labor, all we have is chaos. Base one doesn't care about hierarchy. It doesn't even believe in hierarchy. They just care about discovering the new, but once it's discovered, it needs to be settled, and the base two person is the one who creates the hierarchy. And there are three fundamental indicators of hierarchy, and they've been around since the beginning of humanity. And they are the three spatio-temporal envelopes that we wrap ourselves in. Our clothes, our modes of transportation, and our homes. And this is what demonstrates status. Whether it was a indigenous culture where the chieftain wore the finest furs and was carried on a rug by four people, holding them up, and they lived in the biggest, the prime house, they lived in the biggest, best place. Or whether it's the modern day where people look at what shoes you wear, what car you drive, where do you live, what neighborhood do you live in, how big is your house, all these things. This is status. They say you should always spend money on the things that touch the ground. You want to have nice shoes, you want to have a good bed, and you want to have good tires for your car. Well, these are the three symbols of status. People pay thousands of dollars for shoes. People pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for cars and millions of dollars for houses. These are how we demonstrate status and how we demonstrate hierarchy. And this is the beginning of hierarchy built into the very fabric of the cosmos. We really can't escape it, as much as base 1 people wish they could. So once the base 1 has discovered it, once the base 2 has settled it, then what happens? Well, we have to get along, and that's base 3. That's the yin in the service of yin. That's helping people get along. And this is really the female answer to the male, that the male has the power, or the force, rather, and they are different. You can read power versus force to go into that. But to be able to essentially force or impose, and then what is the female reply to that? To use sexuality. And the sexuality is what can keep everyone from killing each other. It can keep the status in place. Someone is low status and they want to be higher status, and they say, I'm going to kill that person of higher status. And base 3 comes along and says, no, no, no. Have some good food. Have a nice massage. Take a bath. Here's some sex. Here's some pleasure. Forget all about that. We have to work together. It's collaboration in the service of collaboration. It's the principle that says, if we're going to survive this thing, we need to get along, and we need to work together. And how do we get along? Sex. That's how we get along, of different forms. Kind of reminds me of when Lacan was asked about sexuality and psychoanalysis, which there's a stereotype from the time of Freud that psychoanalysts are sex-obsessed. And he said, no, it's quite the opposite. It's not that we're obsessed with the act of sexuality. He said, actually, it's that he gets the same enjoyment talking that he would get from sex, which raises the question if talking isn't another form of sex. So, interesting side note there. And then finally, there's the final question of what do we do after we're all getting along and we have our hierarchies? Well, this is where base 4 comes along. Base 3 is the mother who feeds and nurtures and takes care of everyone. Base 4 is the eldest daughter. This is yang in the service of yin, force in the service of cooperation. In other words, you will be forced to cooperate. Scary, right? We have 3 kinds of cooperation in this world. Base 2, willing cooperation for something that is a higher purpose. Base 3, willing cooperation with no higher purpose, but simply to keep everything moving, or to keep everything, going without killing each other. And then base 4, which is the only form of cooperation that you are forced to cooperate. And this is the principle of design and the principle of ego. At the microcosmic level, this is that part of you that won't back down. This is that part of you that knows how to say no. This is the boundary that you won't cross, But at the macrocosmic, these are the people that design the world we live in. They designed our traffic lights. They designed our schools and our prisons. They designed concentration camps. They designed Netflix. I met a young woman who is a service designer, and I didn't know much about service design. Apparently, it's an incredibly highly paid field that there's only a few hundred people in the world who do this, and they're extremely advanced, sophisticated. They get hired for hundreds of dollars an hour to evaluate the design of services by government, military, medical, you name it. And so they come in and they look at how the service is designed, and they make recommendations for how to redesign the service. The principle of design. If they're good enough at doing what they're doing, they design it so you cooperate with them without even knowing you're cooperating. Ra said that base 2 and 4 were the hardest bases to wake up. And there's reasons for this. If you look at what are called the personality and the design mat, 2 and 4 are in the same position, while 1, 3, and 5 change positions. 3 is in the middle of the design base mat. This is the personality base mat. This is the one we're looking at. It has the personality in the middle. The design base mat has the body in the middle, which also shows that it's body-centric, right? But interestingly, on both the personality and the design base mat, bases 2 and 4, the mind and the design, or the ego, are in the same place. And it's very, very hard to wake these people up and get them into human design. I'm base 2. Why was it hard to get me into human design? Because I'd read about all the problems people are having in their lives, and I wasn't having any of them.
I was wildly successful. Most base 2s are. It's the principle of mind. It works great in the world. I was 23 years old, making more money than I'd ever imagined was possible, working at Amazon with a beautiful girlfriend and an amazing life. I didn't need human design. I found out about it in 2006. I had no interest in human design. I was riding high on life, and I wasn't having some sort of difficulty or friction. It was just so smooth. So base 2 people are often very hard to wake up to human design because their life just operates so smoothly from mental decision making. They're making mental decisions and they have these incredible minds, and so their mind is able to outsmart everyone and outsmart it themselves even. And it really takes some deep inner work or something to happen, or some amazing, it takes some act of grace or serendipity or good luck to finally wake up to something like human design. In my case, it was 9 years after I encountered it that I actually had a number of synchronistic events that brought me to study it further. And then base 4 is the absolute hardest to get into human design ever. I just tell them, if they actually come to me, which they usually don't, and they're really interested in human design, and they have some problems with it, and if they actually trust me enough to say, look, I disagree with this and this and this, and I think Ra was wrong about this, and I think we shouldn't do this, and we shouldn't do that, I just say, why don't you take what you want from human design, make up a bunch of your own words, and design your own system? Because that's all they're really here to do. Ra was base 4. He never would have gotten to human design, not in a million years. He could have reincarnated 1,000 times and had someone try to show him human design 1,000 times. He never would have done it. He had to create his own system from scratch. He had to create his own way of teaching it, his own way of understanding it. Sure, he drew from Kabbalah. Was he interested in Kabbalah? No. He drew from, he didn't really draw from any of them. The voice gave him this system, and then it was up to him to design it with his incredible structuring of the keynotes and so on. And he really spent his life designing it, and he was designing it until the moment he died. He was still designing it, up until the very end. And people said, well, how could he add type, 14 years later and so on? And it's like, well, he was designing it. When you design something, you continue adding, and you continue refining, and you continue massaging it. How come he didn't tell people about strategy and authority in the beginning? Well, he had the base mat back in 1989, and he had the realization that the mind needed access to the movement of life, and it could only do it through the design or through the body. But he didn't put it into the formula of strategy and authority until many years later. But he was designing it. And so just to take it back to the macrocosmic, the base 1 people, they discover it, they name it. The base 2 people create the status and hierarchy. The base 3 makes sure everybody can survive and can sustain it. And then the base 4 people say, this is really inefficient. It would be so much better if we design it this way. It would be so much better if we only drive on the right side of the road or the left side of the road. Or, they make rules, and everyone has to follow those rules. And in the beginning, people are just driving on whatever side they want. Right? But then the design person comes along and says, oh, no, you don't drive that way. And what's funny is new people being born, they just take it for granted. They just take it for granted that you don't do this, you don't do that. It's not done. Why isn't it done? Because the design has essentially structured things in such a way that everyone just takes it for granted and just assumes it's totally normal. There's a great example of a base 4 person, probably, who did this art experiment. I was in Seattle once, and I saw this line around the block to one of the top galleries. It was the Soil Gallery down in Pioneer Square in Seattle, and I stood in line. I asked the people in front of me, I said, what's the line for? And they said, I don't know, but it's something really cool. And then pretty soon, a film crew came, and they had cameras and lights and a microphone, and they're like, how long have you been waiting in line? And the person in front of me is like, I've been here for 20 minutes. And then there's someone down there is, really? I've been waiting here for an hour. And they start interviewing people. The entire experiment is, can you get people to wait in line? The answer is yes. There was nothing in the show. There was nothing in the gallery. The door was locked, and yet people were lined up around the block. Why? Because other people were lined up around the block. Talk about homogenization, but that is the principle of design. Now you might say, let's just get rid of design. Let's just get rid of that base. Can we just erase that one? No, because then nobody would stand up for themselves. It's a base 4 person who probably designed that experiment, making everyone wait in line. It's probably also a base 4 person who says, I'm not going to wait in line anymore, and leaves. What Ra said is this is the backbone, that if there were no base 4s in the world, we would have no backbone. We would be sheep. Nobody would stand up and say, you're oppressing us. We want a new design. We don't like this design. This design, we work 20 hours a day, and you sit around and eat food, and we're working and you're eating. We don't like this design. We're going to overthrow and topple the government, and we're going to design a new government. So it's the base 4 people that actually have the backbone or the ego to sort of embody the empowerment of self. And it makes sense that Ra was such an empowering and empowered person. And finally, base 5. And base 5 is really the ultimate cherry on top, which is that once we've taken care of everything, what is there to do? Witness it. That's the witness. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you need to have food and shelter, and then you need to have companionship and friendship, and you need to have this and that, and finally you have all your needs met. Well, what then? Then you can actually be the passenger. And how does it require a lot of privilege to be a passenger in this world? Every other week I see a thread online of someone saying, human design is just for privileged white Westerners who are using the power of their privilege. How could you tell people to sleep in their own aura when most of the world is sleeping in one room, hovels and things like that? How could you be so arrogant as to tell people that they should live their design when most of the world doesn't have that luxury? It is a luxury to live your design. It's not arrogant, it's just honest. I'm base 2. I'm here to see the hierarchy. We who are in human design are extremely privileged that we get to have the kind of life that we get to experience and witness because we aren't stuck taking care of fundamental needs and things like that, So we actually get to actually develop the awakening of the personality. Which, by the way, Ra said had nothing to do with living your design. We know that living your design circumvents the personality entirely. The mind accesses the being and goes to the movement, or else it accesses that kernel of empowerment within you and accesses the movement that way. But either way, it circumvents the personality. So the personality doesn't even need to be awake to be living your design. And yet, the awakening of the personality as passenger consciousness is perhaps the greatest beauty, something that Ra saw in his rave psychology materials, where he was reluctant to even go into rave psychology. And then when he did, he said, this is, I don't think he used the term cherry on top, but basically like that. This is the sort of final step of the awakening of the personality as a passenger, as a helpless passenger witnessing the movement, witnessing the mind, witnessing the body, and witnessing the design. Thank you so much for listening today. I would like to open it up to any discussions, anything. And yes, Casey, the movement would be unyielding. It's double yang, so it would be the sort of uncooperative. That movement doesn't cooperate with anyone. There are many little things you can find here. Here is just kind of a cute one I was looking at earlier today. Not something Ra said, but I was just kind of working it out myself. We always talk about who, what, when, where, and why. These are the big 5 questions. Well, who is obviously the personality. What is the body, or the objectivity? The base 3 is the principle of objectivity. When would be base 4, because it has to do with progress, growth, decay. When is the right time to do this? Where is base 1? That is always looking for where. Where should I be? Always searching. It's the magnetic monopole. Right? Base 1 is the monopole that takes us along our trajectories, and that is the where. And then why is the base 2, which is the mind. The mind can make up a million reasons why. And you can't answer why without first remembering. You have to remember why. So again, who, base 5, what, base 3, when, base 4, where, base 1, and why is base 2. And these are my own personal associations. Feel free to vary them if you wish, but those are the ones that I've used. Any comments or questions for today? I'm happy to continue on with base theory next week as well.
So how do I, from Nancy, how do I utilize the information to benefit living experience in the mundane? Well, I think if you want to benefit living experience in the mundane, I mean, you probably, the biggest benefit is going to be living your own design, which is really trusting your own decision-making process, because then you will make decisions that benefit you. And they actually benefit everyone. So the decisions that you're making are going to have the greatest benefit. Beyond that, if you want to understand people, you can understand them at many different levels. I don't think, I mean, it's like saying, how does studying quantum physics help you make breakfast? At the same time, it depends what you mean by mundane. I mean, maybe to you, the mundane is just the day-to-day texture of reality, and maybe base will actually crack it wide open so you can't unsee base. I mean, this is actually the danger of studying base theory. The danger being that if you really crack reality open, you might not be able to put it back together again. So, I mean, it really depends what you mean by that. I would say the closest thing to a formula for enlightenment is the study of base theory. So I don't know that it would benefit other than benefiting passenger consciousness and benefiting the ability to surrender and giving a tremendous joy as you see how perfectly designed it all is. And it can, I mean, it's like it can give you pleasure. It can give you joy. It can make your life joyous. As far as how I use it, I mean, I don't usually mention it to people when I give them a reading. I don't usually go into base at all. It's not something that, however, if somebody comes to me and they have a lot of problems with human design, they're almost always base 4. And so then I do notice and I say, okay, well, base 4, you kind of have to come up with your own names. You kind of have to come up with your own way of understanding it. You're not here to take somebody else's design. You're the principle of doing it yourself. It's very DIY. Casey's saying if she wants to be Neo in the Matrix, how can base help her? I mean, if you really study it, you can have all sorts of incredible realizations. I mean, the realizations are, it's kind of a gift that keeps on giving. It's kind of like how Ra said, every letter in the alphabet can be created from from combinations of these fundamental symbols. And I think symbolically what that means is just everything in the world is some combination or the other of base. This is the true alchemy. This is what the alchemists were actually studying. They weren't trying to turn lead into gold. They were trying to understand the formulas for the composition of everything in the Maya. And everything in the Maya has its formula. Everything in the Maya has its unique number, its unique address. Something is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Something is 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Something is 2, 2, 2, 3, 3. And all of these have different qualities. And you can even take a penta, and a penta of people, you could have one from each base. You could have all the same base. You could have a mixture of bases. However you look at it, it is the permutations and the combinations that make up the actual qualities, or qualia, to use the philosophical term, of reality. So it's about as deep as you can get. It is the fundamental building blocks of reality. And so it's not necessarily going to be something that you bring to somebody. If you gave me a choice of knowing what base somebody was or knowing what type they were, it really depends. If they were somebody I knew very well and I could only ever know their base or their type, I may actually want to know their base more than their type. But I think I would also be able to figure it out. I can usually figure it out after a while. I can usually guess people's bases. It's one of those things that once you see the base, you can't really unsee it, because you start to notice how deep it goes. And on the one hand, it can be very hard to see on the surface, but on the other hand, once you see how deep it goes, you begin to get the secrets of deep affinities that don't seem connected at all. Hanifa's base. I always had you as base 4, but I don't know. I just always thought you were base 4. But you could be a different base. We can guess. Didn't you tell me you were base 2 or something? I don't know. I thought you were. Casey I have as base 5, but I think maybe you told me that. So I don't know. Ricky seems base 4 to me, but I might have seen that. See, I might have been spoiled for me already. But it's hard to. I don't know. I may have been exposed. I may have already seen your bases before.
Okay. Genoa said, guess him.
His base. Huh. Well, it's a little tricky. So
I would want to. I mean, that is an interesting one. There are definitely. I've had this conversation with people before where it's almost like we're not just one base, we're all five of them, and so you really just have to see which one is the strongest. So I'll just use some of my heuristics for the bases, and I'll just describe them in brief. Base 1 is really cutting edge, and so when I see base 1 people, they tend to be very anti-hierarchical and interested in the new, and they're not really interested as much in the preservation of knowledge, typically. So I would guess not base 1 for Genoa, because I see him preserving knowledge, and I also see comfort with hierarchy, that there's no problem with hierarchy. I don't see this anti-hierarchical thing. Base 2, they really stand out as having the most incredible minds with an encyclopedic knowledge, and they often have health issues or other issues that have caused them to really develop a strong sense of spirit. So if I had to guess, base 2 is a strong contender, just on account of having this incredible encyclopedic mind and stuff like that.
On his birth certificate, it was a 1, but on the time that he's using from rectification, it's a 5.
Oh, it's a 5. Interesting. Okay. Well, 5s are the hardest to tell, and I can explain why in a moment. So here's kind of my heuristics. Base 1 people I usually see as sort of unusual and wild and separate from humanity and kind of uncivilized. There's no civilization, like crude and crass and kind of the people that just do like weird things. Like someone collected over 10,000 copies of the Jerry Maguire VHS and they put them all in one place. That's a base 1 person. Like they just are doing weird things, They're living alone. They're doing. Von Paul is base 1, if you know, or Michael Steenbeck Litvin is base 1. He was listening to car commercial sound. They listen to something that's not music. It's like, what's that? Oh, it's a blender. Why are you listening to it? Oh, I enjoy the sound of it. That's very base 1. Base 2. These people have incredible, brilliant minds, and they're very comfortable with hierarchy, and they can basically. Have a lot of problems in life, and the part of the question is how do they face that adversity? Like if a base 2 person might lose a limb, or they might have a speech impediment, or they might lose an eye, or they might have some debilitating illness or disease. And the question is, do they maintain a healthy spirit? I'm base 2, so I've had a lot of issues, and I've had to kind of maintain a healthy spirit. And usually you notice base 2 people because you say that's someone who has a truly exceptional mind. Base 3. These are people who use sexuality to smooth over anything. They use charisma to smooth over anything at all. So it's people that it's really hard to get mad at because they say, you're not really mad at me. Come on. And they put their arm around you. And base 3 is just so good at mothering and nurturing. And it's so caring for the welfare of people and making sure they don't fight and making sure everything gets along, making sure we know how to collaborate. Base 4, that is the principle of ego, and my usual way of detecting them is that they have no interest in human design or what anybody else has ever done. So similar to base 1, perhaps in some sense, but what they really want to do is their thing. They want to create, it's ego. It's the principle of ego. So they're not interested in working with someone else. They'll say they're going to work with you, but then they design things in such a way that you end up working for them. And so base 4 is sort of, I would say, people that have a strong sense of resistance to human design and typically need to create their own version of it. Dave Myers is base 4, and I've learned a lot about it from him. And I guessed he was base 4 before he told me, because he would periodically go into this thing where he just hates human design. And he says he'll never do it again. He won't touch it. He can't stand it. He thinks it's all bogus. Then he comes back around to it. But I think it's because he doesn't want to take something that somebody else made. And there's always these questions of like, how come people could take something so perfect and beautiful as human design and then make their own version of it? Like, don't they understand what an amazing gift Ra has given us? Well, the answer is they're base 4. They don't understand the gift of what Ra has given us. They don't. Base 4, but again, I don't want to make any assumptions about you, Ricky, or Dave, or any base 4 people. And even when I thought, Hanifa, Oh, base 3. Oh my God, you're base 3, Hanifa. Interesting. Okay. Well, see, I didn't know that. So, and again, it's not like I'm some psychic and I can just imagine what base somebody is. It's just kind of what they seem like from the outside. But, it can be hard to know because you end up in interesting situations where a base 3 person, it's just, you don't always see that. It's not always obvious to see that aspect of it. Base 1s have the dirtiest houses. That's true. I don't know. Von Paul is base 1, and he's never had a dirty house, but it's because he only owns the possessions he can fit into a small handbag, which is a very base 1 thing. He's just like ready to move, ready to be on the go. Okay, so base 4 people. Oh, and you're trying to merge knowledge of ancient astrology with this. Wonderful. Yeah, I encourage base 4 people. I mean, base 4 has such a strong backbone and such a strong sense of personal integrity. And I love my base 4 people. The ones that I have a hard time connecting with are actually base 1, even though Mike is like my best friend. But base 1, I have the biggest disconnect from because I'm not able to, literally in the actual base mat, you'll see that they are disconnected. That bases 3 and 4 have the furthest apart, and bases 1 and 2. And then base 5, the way that Ra describes them is that they are blending in and you would never notice them, that they blend in as sort of human furniture, like you would say about the models, and that you would never even notice them. You don't remember if they're at the party or not until they step into the force of their design and really live their design and their life force. And at that point, they become memorable and they actually become like the kind of person that you might even fantasize about, and they come to embody a certain type, like the girl next door type, or they actually come to embody characteristics of something bigger than them, like the all-American boy, or that base 5 starts as being totally forgettable, and nobody would even remember they were alive. But then if they're really living their design, they become personalities in the sense of a TV personality, like a Johnny Carson. And they become, they go from being sort of invisible part of the Maya to being these outspoken personalities that are easy to fantasize about and actually can embody characteristics of the other 4 bases, making them very hard to type, other than they have a sort of dreamy quality about them, almost like a Piscean thing from an astrology perspective, what we would normally associate as Piscean, that there's a dreamy quality and that there's a sensitivity to sound and things like that you find. So there are other heuristics too, and I think we should continue this next week because it's such a rich field, and I think we can even talk about, like, maybe it would be interesting if you're back next week, maybe if anyone actually is here next week who wants to keep talking about their base and talk about their experiences of their base, like, Hanifa, understanding what it's like to be base 3 and how do you experience that, and do you disagree with any of those descriptions? I'd love to hear. I'd love to be updated on it because, again, Ra gave us breadcrumbs, but so much of it it's almost like the glass bead game or something, where you have to intuitively scry into the deepest essence of something and then see how that deep essence is also the same as the deep essence of something else. So in the Maya, they seem completely separated, but at a deep level, they're parts of the same thing. And we can actually do that next week when we look at the keynotes, because some of these keynotes, they're very bizarre. Progress is smelled. What does that mean, right? Or we have keynotes about how, about rhythm, keynotes about music, keynotes about all sorts of things. And it's kind of an interesting question of where do these things fit? What are they a part of? Like even the question about spirit. That spirit is one of the keynotes of base 2, and yet I was associating it more with base 4. So again, these are we're in deep waters here, but I think very rewarding waters as well. So I'm really looking forward to continuing next week. Thank you, Lisa. I'm so glad Lisita and Genoa suggested this topic. So yeah, thank you so much. Let's see if I can, how do you do the heart? I've never been able to, there we go. There's the heart. I was watching the end of Curb Your Enthusiasm, and Larry David was trying to make a heart and he couldn't do it. It was so funny, but I was able to. All right, thank you all, and I'll see you next week. Really, really enjoyed this. Thanks so much.